Welcome everybody to our first spring geography colloquium. This was a real success last semester, being co-hosted with UNM and NMSU, both geography departments, going back and forth hosting speakers. I want to say thanks again and in advance to Chris Brown, who is managing colloquium on the NMSU side. And we're delighted to kick off this first here at UNM. I want to also just say thank you to, Geography and Environmental Studies is the host department for this talk, but we have co-sponsorship from the Sustainability Studies program. So thank you for getting involved with this one, and also from the Center for Community Geography has teamed up. So we're delighted to be bringing Laura Ann Minkoff-Zern to campus virtually, and she's been meeting people earlier today to talk about food things. And this is wrapping up the day here with the research colloquium. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Marigold Walsh-Dilley to introduce our speaker. And after that, Laura Ann, you can just go ahead and share your screen and kick it off. I don't think you need me to come back, but I will if needed. All right, so guys, as usual, after the talk, if you want to submit questions into the chat, I will read them off so that we can kind of keep it all managed without everybody trying to talk at once. Okay, Marigold, take it away.
Thanks. So I'm really delighted to introduce Laura Ann Minkoff-Zern today. So Dr. Minkoff-Zern is an associate professor and director of graduate studies of the Food Studies Department at Syracuse University, and she is also affiliated faculty in the Department of Geography there, among a few other departments. She holds her PhD in geography from University of California at Berkeley, and I'm particularly pleased that we get to have Laura Ann here today, since her work really covers some of the most exciting new ideas in food studies and the geography of food, including things like the intersections of food and racial justice, immigration, labor movements, and making a big case for why we need to take labor into account when we talk about sustainability. I think in a really important work that she's doing there. And I see her name all over the place these days in food studies. So today she'll be talking about her recent book, The New American Farmer, Immigration, Race, and the Struggle for Sustainability, which came out recently from MIT Press in 2019, and which won the First Book Award prize from the Geographies of Food and Agriculture Specialty Group at the AAG, and also, really importantly, is available for free open access downloads on the MIT Press website. So I encourage all of you guys to go and download her book, which is really fantastic. She's also published widely across geography and in other disciplines as well, but some of the places that her work appears has been in Geoforum, the Journal of Peasant Studies, Food, Culture and Society, Antipode, Agriculture and Human Values, and Renewable Agriculture and Food Systems, among other places. And I also wanted to just sort of mention that she participated in the Food Across Borders Symposium, which is funded by the Clement Center for Southwest Research, and which allowed us to spend a week up in Taos together, just thinking about food and border issues, particularly in the Southwest, but not only, which is how I got to know Laura Ann. So thanks very much for being here, Laura Ann, and everyone please help me welcome Laura Ann to the University of New Mexico and New Mexico in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a really generous introduction. Of course, I wish I was in New Mexico today with you all. Not that I'm sad to be in upstate New York because it's snowy and beautiful, but I miss the opportunity to talk to people in person. Like Marigold was saying, getting to actually have these conversations in depth is such a perk. So I look forward to that happening at some point in the future. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So as Marigold said, The New American Farmer is my book out with MIT Press. I'm going to be talking about today, this research project, which I like that you already plugged that it's open access, available open access on the MIT Press website, which I'm really happy about because it means it's accessible to people. So this book is the culmination of, building out of my dissertation, my postdoc work, and then my first several years at Syracuse, looking at the transition of farm workers to becoming farmers. And so I'll talk a little bit about the methods, the questions of the book, and focus in on a few of the arguments that I make here. And so just, how did I get a little bit to this work? As Mariel was saying, my work is always focused on the intersection between sustainability and labor, or sustainability and social justice in the food system. And so I worked, during my graduate work, I was primarily focused on farm workers, and I was looking at farm worker food insecurity and the ways that farm workers were coping with food insecurity in California. And one of the things I started to see in the field is, not only did farm workers know a lot about agriculture and growing practices, of course, but that so many farm workers identified not only as workers, but as farmers, right? The majority of field workers in fruit and vegetable production in the United States, the vast, vast majority are immigrants from Mexico and Central America. And I started hearing a lot about their agricultural knowledge, their nutritional knowledge. And so rather than telling a story about kind of exploited workers, I wanted to tell the story about the contributions that they make to the food system. And in doing my work around food insecurity among farm workers, I started to focus on farm worker gardens. And then that built to farm worker farms. And while I was in California, people told me, well, this is not a thing that can happen because we know getting into farming is so difficult. Just the capital investment, the skills you need to start a business, the competition. But I just started to see that it really was happening, that there were so many small farms being started by workers, by immigrants. And when I started to pay attention to it and talk to people, I realized that it was everywhere, right? All over the country. And that's where the idea for this project came out of. And since then, I've been able to travel across the United States looking at farm workers that have started their own farms. So that's what I'll be talking about today, is that project and the book that came out of it. So my work, as I'll talk about my methods in just a minute, is interview-based and ethnographic, not so much quantitative, but I think it's important to start by pointing out that the quantitative data supports everything that I'm going to talk about today. So the USDA Agricultural Census categorizes, self-identified Spanish, Hispanic, or Latino origin farmers, which is very different than the group of people that I interviewed are all particularly first generation and first generation immigrants that have worked as farm workers. So the USDA data is much broader than that, just anyone that identifies as Hispanic or Latino. But I think the fact that their data really reflects what I was seeing shows kind of the scale of what's going on in terms of, Spanish speaking, Latino, Latinx identified, Hispanic identified farmers in the United States is huge. And maybe New Mexico, this might not be as much of a surprise to you there. Certainly in places where I've done my research, it's something that a lot of people were surprised to hear. And so I think most notably is that number of farmers is growing. So according to USDA data, which, like I said, is a broader category. At the same time, I think USDA, and I have an article where I critique this, but they actually don't really catch a lot of the farmers that I was interviewing. So because of the way that they largely find farm owners through land ownership, through work with previous work with USDA, and so many of the farmers that I was working with never filled out a census form, never worked with the USDA, and are working on kind of very informal land access and land ownership situations. So they're not even catching everyone I'm talking about. But the fact that there's such a massive increase, right? 79% in self-identified Latino Hispanic farmers over 15 years says a lot, right? And that's happening in the context of what the USDA calls traditional farmers, US-born white farmers, reaching retirement age, right? So farmers over age 65 are aging out of farming, and their children don't want to take it over for really good reason. Anyone that's worked on a farm or been involved in agriculture knows that the cost and the labor is high, and you don't make a lot of money, right? Even well-established farms are struggling, right? Especially today in the context of climate change and trade wars. This is not a stable, or you could say really rational business to go into. And I'll talk about that. Why are people doing it despite the challenges? So in addition to us knowing that there's a big gap in agriculture, the white farmers are retiring, the people that have access to land and resources are retiring without their children taking it up. We also know, and this will relate to the types of farms that I was looking at, is that there's a larger demand for organic food in the US, larger than we can fill. So there's consumer interest in the specific types of agriculture, which I look at alternative agriculture more broadly, which there aren't numbers around the broad definition of alternative, right? But we do have numbers around organic, and we know that there's a demand for, certain types of alternative farming and food and regional food and local food that really can't be met, and arguably more so, since the pandemic, right? So all that's to give some context as to why this matters, and the importance of looking at immigrants in the ways that they contribute to agriculture, not just as workers, right, but as people with knowledge, skills, and background to kind of the types of farming that we need in the US today. So I start the book with a quote from one farmer in Washington State. She was a farmer that still had her day job on a farm and was working very hard on some rented land with her partner. And one of the questions that I asked all the farmers was, well, why are you doing this, right? This is so difficult. For many of them, they go to their day job, then they do this in the evening. It's really difficult to get into. It's difficult to access land. Most of them don't speak any English. There's just so many barriers. So I heard a lot of the stories as to why farming was meaningful, growing food was so meaningful to them. And this was, I think, a really striking story. So their farm was named Mariposa Farm, or butterflies. And she said, we wanted to name it Mariposa because, do you know the story of the monarchs, the monarch butterflies? They need to fly from Mexico to Canada. Some of them die crossing the border to reach Canada. Some of the parents die during the trip, but the children know how to come back. I think that we as Latinos have a lot in common with the butterflies, because in order to be here, we have to cross borders. And sadly, a lot of times families lose their loved ones. But their children here, the children who are born here, always have the need of knowing their parents' roots and always go back looking for it. And so a lot of the focus of the book and what I heard was really about this agrarian identity and the value of growing food to them that went much beyond kind of the economics of owning a business or running a farm. But teaching their children, returning something that felt like home to them, even when they couldn't go home, was kind of the cornerstone of why so many immigrants are trying to start farms in the US. So to scale back, the book looks at a lot of questions. So I'm going to outline what these questions are and then kind of zoom into what I think I have time to talk about today. So why are farm workers starting their own farms despite challenges, as I was just saying? What is the historic context, right, that's determined? I'm not going to talk about this as much today, but I start by looking at the history of dispossession of Native Americans, of slavery, the relationship between kind of the sharecropping system and some of the experiences of immigrant workers in agriculture today. So I look at kind of the racialized history of farm work and small scale farmers and the challenges to farming. That's in the book if you're interested in that. So how does their race and ethnicity and citizenship status affect their ability to practice and the types of identity that they have related to food and farming? What does this transition from workers to owners mean for kind of understanding social movements around labor and social justice, which was one of the questions I started my work with? And what's their role in today's growing food movements, right? What does this mean for those of us that want to see a change in the food system, both for, ecological sustainability and for social justice? How can we look to immigrant farmers for some of these answers? So what I'll talk about today is the challenges that they are facing, the relationship between race, ethnicity, and citizenship status as to kind of why they do this, and what I think the potential role is that they can play in growing food movements. So there's a lot of literature that I draw on from kind of political economy of food and agriculture and peasant studies literature. I look a lot at the agrarian question. But I think what really has guided my work in this is, work such as that of Psyche Williams-Forson and Meredith Abarca that really understand, that help us understand the relationship between culture, identity, and food, and the ways that food is a form of resistance, right? And that has always underlined kind of the types of questions that I ask and what I want to understand from the people that I talk to. And so there's many scholars that work on this, but they're the ones I always like to point to as kind of influencing how I formed some of these questions. You'll say all these photos are photos that I took during research at the farmers market. This is a set of really, diverse beans that were being grown in California. So a little bit on my methods or the bigger picture. I did this work across about 8 years in 5 different states, starting in California where I was doing my dissertation work. Followed, and some of it really is just snowball of places that I lived and places that I was connected and working. I did my postdoc work at Goucher College in Baltimore. And while I was there, I started connecting more with people working in the federal level of the USDA and started learning more about some of the refugee and immigrant farming programs there, and connected with some people in the the northern neck of Virginia. So there was a whole group of farmers in Virginia that I did interviews with. I then was able to do some work in the Hudson Valley in New York. And then I've also been able to do interviews in Washington State as well as Minnesota. And in all of these places, there's a lot of differences. But I think the things that they had in common and the reasons that I ended up in these places is that there were large immigrant populations that have been there for multiple generations. So that means that there, at least in the farm worker community, that there was a lot of fruit and vegetable production. And that there were urban centers that they could sell directly to. So there were direct markets. So for the immigrant farmers that I spoke with, direct markets were really important because of their scale, because of the diversity that they grew. So selling in farmers markets and directly to consumers that was the way that they could sell. So they needed to be somewhat near an urban area. I definitely could have continued this work. I, at one point, did talk to someone in New Mexico about coming down there. Certainly the Southwest was really, I think, left out of this research in a way. And it's not because I don't think it's happening there. It was really just a practical point of kind of when do you stop and write the book. And so I stopped, but I think, I could have gone to probably every state in the US and continued this research. So it'll be interesting to me kind of how what I say compares to what maybe some of you have seen there. And I should say, so I did about 100 interviews over this time, including over 70 farmers themselves, where I mostly visited farms and visited them at farmers markets, as well as people in the USDA, University Extension. USDA was local, regional, and national offices, and any nonprofits that were working directly with immigrant farmers. So that included a lot of farm incubators and other kind of like small business programs in these regions. So yeah, a total of about 100 interviews. And quite a bit of time spent, on farms doing more ethnographic work. So as I said, what I'm looking at here and have been looking at is this real transition, not just farm worker to farmer, but farmer to farm worker to farmer. So most of the farmers that I talk to say, well, yeah, I've always been a farmer. I never stopped being a farmer. Most of them, come from agricultural backgrounds, some combination of subsistence farming as well as market farming. In Mexico is the vast majority are from Mexico, a handful from Central America. But they really always identified as a farmer, as a campesino, and they come to the US. That doesn't stop for them. They start working on industrial farms or working for other people, or for some, they might have done that in northern Mexico first before they come to the US. So then when they go back to their own farm, it's a very natural progression, right? And so in terms of, more theoretical questions around agrarian transition, it's been a really, I have an article in Journal of Peasant Studies looking at kind of like this transition. It's a bit the opposite of what has been predicted in agrarian studies, is that you'd go from these different phases of labor. and in particular to go into non-industrial farming after being involved in industrial farming is what I think is surprising or needed to be explained. So I'm looking at this process, right? And what does this mean for the broader world of food? So, one of the not surprising parts of this study is, I think, the difficulties, right? And the challenges that they're up against. So most farmers that I spoke with didn't have past middle school level formal education. Many didn't have past elementary school. So that's even in Spanish. And then for many of them, especially out West, their first language isn't Spanish. If they're indigenous, it was Triqui or Mixteco from southern Mexico. So then the idea of, filling out any forms to start a business, and starting a farm business is bureaucratic in the United States. Even if you're selling at a farmer's market, even if you're renting land, to even get into a farmer's market, there's a lot of forms. To get certified organic, there are a lot of forms. In order to do that, right, you need certifications, you need ID, you need insurance. So these types of things are really challenging, especially if someone doesn't speak English, if they don't have a formal education, and particularly if they're undocumented. In addition to that, right, there's overt discrimination going on. I certainly spoke with many market managers that talked about the challenges of working with immigrants, maybe not hearing their own bias, right, but kind of assuming that they weren't going to be telling them the truth, or that they'd be selling other people's crops, right, and that's was not hidden from the farmers themselves. So on top of that kind of discrimination at markets and from other farmers themselves, who didn't like this competition from their workers or people they saw as their workers, there's documented discrimination that's happened at the level of the USDA. And so I'll go back to that slide, but many of you might know about the Pigford case of African-American farmers suing the USDA. So there's also a less known about Hispanic and women farmers and ranchers case that was actually being settled while I was doing my research. So I was able to interview people at the USDA about this process, as well as kind of the lack of knowledge among the farmers that I interviewed about this case. And I can answer questions about kind of what was going on at the time, but they were settling a case that was looking at discrimination, that happened 30 years ago at the time, 40 years ago now. And there wasn't really much outreach to the community that it would have affected. And then ironically, when they did settle the case, people had to, unlike the Pigford case, farmers had to send in their individual claims to say, I was discriminated against 30 years ago. And the majority of the claims that were sent in by these farmers were tossed out because people hadn't filled out the paperwork correctly. Right, which just kind of follows up on the type of discrimination that or challenges that I was seeing and hearing about. So this is one farmer I interviewed in California who was actually relatively successful. She had been through an incubator farmer training program in California in the 90s and had started her own farm. She was certified organic and sold at many Bay Area markets, which are very competitive to get into. And I asked her about this. I said, do you go take advantage of loans, of grants? Do you go into the USDA offices or extension or anything? And she said to me, if you go to an agency, this is in Spanish, and you're a Latino person and you're a woman and you don't speak the language and you don't have money, and you go to an agency of the federal government and you want to find someone to speak your language, well, how do you say this? The government doesn't want to help you. They don't want to have a person that speaks your language. And in that conversation, she clearly meant that not literally, but also kind of metaphorically, that you can't walk in. They don't expect you to be a farmer. They don't really respect you. And that was affirmed when I would call USDA offices before a research trip. And I'd say, I'm going to be in this county. I'd love to talk to someone in your lending or, your insurance, whatever, and about Latino farmers. And do you have anyone that works with immigrant farmers? And they'd say, oh, well, this is like 9 times out of 10. Well, you should call the labor department because we don't work with farm workers. And I'd say, actually, I'm interviewing farmers. And then eventually I'd get in and talk to them. And right, the fact that they just weren't even aware that people were in their county or in their region that they should be reaching out to. So a little bit about like beyond these challenges, why are people doing this? Why would you kind of, with very little, capital, with very little resources to invest, and knowing that it's such a hard business, why would people try and start their own farms? It's more difficult than starting a restaurant, right? But what I really heard from people is it was so much more than a business. They talked about a sense of home as immigrants, a sense of a place to, preserve tradition and practice and teach their children, a place to reclaim, their experience of working with their body, of being outside. And when I started the work, people would say, well, why would you work as one job during the day and then do the same thing at night? Isn't it really similar? But if you can imagine someone that's working on an industrial, say, strawberry field during the day, and you're weeding and doing something repetitive, and you don't get to choose what kind of crops are planted, you certainly don't get to feed your family when you work as an industrial farm worker. So for them, then the contrast of going to their own farm in the afternoon or after work, I mean, it was difficult, but it was incredibly different. They could have their family there, their kids could be playing outside. Many of them would live in very cramped housing situations without outdoor space. So this provided, a place for their family to be, and for them to share that with their family and grow food for their family. And yes, they were trying to run businesses, but it was, the feeding their family always came first. So even if they had kind of whittled it down to a few crops that they specialized in at the market, they'd have, a milpa on the side where they were growing food for their family, or particular herb varieties that they couldn't sell at the market. So there was something more to it. What I also saw was that, generally the farms, not only were they really small, so 4 to 60 acres at the most, but that was really how they wanted to stay. So, this idea of what an alternative farm is, whether that's the definition of diverse, small scale, selling to direct markets. Well, actually, I have a slide I'm about to get to that says all this. But that was how they wanted to be. So even the larger, 40 or 60 acre farms, they really didn't want to get any bigger. They did not want to become industrial farmers. That was not the goal, to scale up. And this has to do with, that they saw farming as a livelihood, as a practice, as an identity. It wasn't just a business. So this is one farmer in New York. When we talked about why he does this, he said, well, it's part of our heritage. We want to be able to not just get up at a certain time, not just jump in a car and leave your house. It's more a way of life. Being able to raise your kids at home, because where we're from, everybody has a farm, and every single person in town has their own farm. And a lot of people ask, well, is that kind of the goal, to have a farm to pass down to their kids? And certainly some of the farmers I met already had, teenage or adult kids that were involved in the farm, and it was something they were very proud of. And there were even, I talked to some adult children of the farmers that were really proud of the farm and wanted to make it their career. And then, of course, there were plenty of farmers that said, well, no, I want them to do whatever they want to do, right? There wasn't a sense that their kids had to farm. Or, well, this is a backup for them. Well, if anything, if all else fails, they know how to grow food, right? This is the skill that I'm passing on. And whether the kids are going to farm or not, it's about giving them this knowledge. So another farmer in Virginia who said to me, life in the United States is very, very ugly. Each person stays in their own house. There's no time. People live by their watch, and there's a lot of stress. In contrast, on her farm, it's a little bit like Mexico. Makes me feel the same. It's not the same exactly, but it's more free. And in the city, there's more pressure. So Catalina had come to the northern neck of Virginia as a berry picker. She had migrated up and down the coast with the berry harvest and had settled and started a mixed fruit and vegetable and flower farm, and she sold at the market. And it was just really one of the most beautiful farms that I visited. And so another question I asked is, well, so why not grow industrially? Why not replicate the kind of farms that you worked on? And again, it was a lot about their relationship to farming and agriculture. Well, I like the life of a farmer. I don't necessarily recommend it. You have to love agriculture. You have to love farming the way you love money, more than you love money. One of the first things is you have to love this, and you can't do it for the money. That's part of farming, right? So it's not really like economically rational to start these farms, especially with the barriers and challenges that they have. there's another farmer in California, and he was literally on this tiny little hillside near tons of strawberry fields. And he had been a farm worker in the strawberry fields. And when I asked him why he did it this way, he said, well, they do it for the money, but I do it for the freedom, right? There's a freedom to this experience for him. So as I was saying before, right, an argument that I make in the book is that there are people working in agriculture today, whether they have access to land and they've started their own farm or whether they're still workers, that have the knowledge to create the kind of food system that we hear about all the time, right? The alternative food system. So whether for you that means certified organic or biodynamic, a local system, a direct market system, there's a lot of different ways to kind of categorize alternative farming. But what I saw was really consistent, which was small scale, low off-farm inputs, certainly not all certified organic, because organic certification is a whole nother bureaucracy. And when you're renting, it's also hard to get certified if you don't have land tenure. They're very diverse. They prioritize selling to direct markets. They weren't really, for the most part, interested in selling to large, the middle person, the coolers. And they relied mostly on family labor, although not completely. And I'm not trying to say that family labor is always ideal. Certainly there's all sorts of gender dynamics that I didn't get too much into in my research. But what it really does is it signifies a different type of business structure, right? Or a different type of farm structure. They are not employing a lot of people from off the farm, and they don't really want to. And so what all of this looks like to me, right, is what so many people are looking for, is an alternative food system that is more ecologically sustainable, and ideally more regionally and locally based. And arguably they have the knowledge to do this, they just don't have the resources for the most part. So this research, and hopefully I'm at a good kind of time to start wrapping up. This research, I think, leaves us, of course, with questions, right? And I think the big questions here is, is this sustainable? Will the farmers survive? And what does this mean for social justice movements related to agriculture? So I argue that immigrant farmers show us a real opportunity for low resource, for farmers of color, right? For those that have been marginalized in agriculture and exploited in agriculture historically, to be part of a growing alternative food system, right? If we give them the resources that they need to do so. And help them get over those barriers actively. Unfortunately, though, from what I saw is, they're not immune to what's going on in the food system overall, that it is more profitable to grow industrially, to reduce your crop diversity. I saw the farmers, especially in California, where I worked for the longest, over several years, many of them just couldn't get into the types of markets where they would make enough money, and they had to start selling to kind of the middle, the brokers. So that means less diverse crops, and having to scale up to make enough, right? And of course, scaling up means hiring more workers. And unfortunately, right, none of this really solves the problem of labor justice in the fields. And it even sometimes looks even worse on low resource farms, simply because they have even less money to pay their workers, right? They're certainly not paying themselves health insurance. The types of benefits that we'd like to see on all farms for workers is even less possible on a small farm, right? And that's not just true of immigrants, that's true of all small farms. And so while they might not want to reproduce some of the inequalities that they experienced working, there's no guarantee that just because they were immigrants, they're immigrants, just because they're have an experience in the field, that things end up being better for workers on their farms. I mean, I heard some of the same things from immigrant farm owners that I've heard from white farm owners, which is, oh, well, I always give them breaks and I always make sure they have Gatorade. And, so there's kind of the same paternalism because there's a lack of economic ability to pay more in this case. So it doesn't solve the labor problem. But I think does provide us with some opportunities to rethink what an alternative food system could look like, especially if we recognize that the knowledge exists, right? Too often, I think the types of farms that become the cornerstone of the alternative food systems are people that are not growing up in agriculture, people that need to go through extensive training, people that struggle along the way. And not to say that they shouldn't be farming too, but we're overlooking the people that actually can do this and have a different type of experience. So I like to end on this quote. This is a farmer in Washington State who he had an incubator plot at a place called Viva Farms, only about 2 acres. He was very young, still going to his day job and doing this in the evening, just really working hard. And when I asked him why he does it, he says, well, if the sun comes out for everybody, why have envy? It comes out for everybody, for the blondes, the Latinos, the Japanese, for everybody. The sun does not discriminate, and the rain falls for every farmer. So my acknowledgements, of course, of everyone that I interviewed and funders and all the students that I've been able to work with. But I will go ahead and stop the share so I can actually see people.
Great, thank you so much, Laura Ann. I'm going to ask if you have a question to ask. We have plenty of time to have questions and conversation here. If you want to drop something into the chat, I can manage those and read them off. If people want to ask follow-up questions, of course, you can unmute and we can have some conversation, but we do have a pretty big crowd here, so might make most sense to start with the chat. And I noticed that we have a lot of folks from outside our department, so it'd be great to hear where people are coming from and how you intersect with some of the work that we're talking about here. There's one question already in here that's just to me, and I'm going to answer this for everybody, which is where the recordings of the videos will be available. We've been posting all of the colloquium talks are recorded, and they're all posted on the Geography and Environmental Studies Department website at UNM. And then I believe NMSU is also posting them on their website as well, but they're definitely, all of them are on our website. Okay, so first question for you, Laura Ann, from Brad Hansen. Do you know any specific policies that would help small farms be more viable? Smallest change for the greatest good kind of thing.
Yeah, and I have already started to see some really great things, not so much in terms of like, state or national policies at this point yet, but some organizational changes that have come out of the research. So really simple things such as making sure that documents are translated. So like the Northeast Organic, what's the name? The NOFA in the Northeast, Organic Farming Association. When, I was talking to some people from there and they just kind of realized, oh, we thought we had everything translated, and they checked and it wasn't. And so I think just having things translated into multiple languages available online and not making that whole process of finding forms so difficult for people is huge when they don't have someone sitting there walking them through it. And then I do think as far as, places like Extension and local organizations is just recognizing the very different needs of immigrant farmers and the very different education levels. So, things I've heard is, oh, well, it's not that much paperwork, or, oh, it's just $500 a year, right? And so when you're, and that really might sound like not that much to someone that has some kind of educational background or any type of resources. But when farm workers who make on an average like $12,000 a year hear $500 a year, well, they're not going to join that market, or they're not going to. So I think just thinking about the very small things that can change that are just much bigger barriers than they would be to other farmers. So whether it's linguistic, whether it's outreach, realizing that people aren't on your listservs, because I do think that farm workers and immigrant farmers are really socially isolated in a way, even within agrarian communities. And so like when I was talking to people in USDA or extension offices, and it's not that they're intentionally always leaving, I try and give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think after long conversations, they'd be like, well, right. I mean, if people have never come into the office, then they're not on my list. Right? And it's like, yeah. And if someone immigrated 20 years ago and has just been a worker, they're not on the list and they might not be comfortable coming in. So I think just thinking through some of those really simple barriers, in terms of language and comfort and paperwork can go a long way in terms of immigrants feeling more welcomed in organizations. So that's not so much a policy answer, but like what's the really low hanging fruit, I guess.
Awesome, thanks.
Okay, we got a couple nice juicy methods questions. Marigold is asking on behalf of her qualitative methods students who are also in attendance, whether you could speak about how you gained entree into your field sites, how you connected with farmers, and how you negotiated access to research participants.
Yeah, you know, and I think it differed a little bit every state or kind of, you know, site. So when I was in graduate school, I did a much more long-term ethnographic project where I was working with the California Institute of Rural Studies. I connected with activists. I took the time to really spend time in the community and gain people's trust. I volunteered on farm worker gardens and really got to know people. And in that way, I became trusted within a particular community of farm workers. You know, as life moved on and I didn't actually have that privilege of spending the same kind of time in the field, it became a lot more through contacts. And I think that changes the nature of that trust and how much people are going to say, you know, so I have to recognize that when I did my interviews. So in my postdoc and since I've become faculty, the interviews became shorter, the trips became, you know, short and intense, and I'd get introduced by like a nonprofit organization that had contacts in a farm worker community, or in Washington State, it was all through Viva Farm, which was an incubator. And they introduced me to the market managers who would introduce me to the farm workers. And then people would either be willing to talk to me or not, and it'd be a one-time meeting for many of them. So I always had to kind of think about who had introduced me and what that might mean about what they would say. But I think just being open to kind of whoever could introduce me. And sometimes it was, I ended up in Minnesota just at a conference and someone came up and said, oh, there's a whole community in Minnesota you should meet. And so I just went and spent 2 weeks there. You know, so it was, it really depended based on where I was, but a lot of farmers markets and just spending time at farmers markets and, but knowing which farmers markets to go to.
Okay, there's a follow-up from Daniel Bean. I think you've addressed some of this, but just in case Daniel wants to follow up. He said for his MS thesis, he interviewed far fewer farmers and was suspicious that the folks who were willing to participate might have represented a smaller group of farmers willing to talk to researchers rather than the broad community, which might be suspicious of the academy. So do you think that problem was solved by interviewing 100 people, or if not, how do you address that particular bias?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think as researchers or people affiliated with, you know, an academic institution, we're always going to have people that don't want to talk to us. I mean, interestingly for me, this research followed from my identity as like a graduate student to being a postdoc researcher, as no one really knew what that was, to being a faculty. And also like I'm a student writing a dissertation to I'm a professor writing a book, right? And I think even those perceptions of me probably change things. I never got the sense that people didn't want to talk to me because I came from a university. I got the sense that maybe some people just didn't want to take the time to be interviewed because they weren't interested. You know, so of course the people that were willing to talk were had to be interested at some point, at some level of telling their story. And interestingly, I think working with a somewhat undocumented community, and even if the person I was talking to was clearly documented, they were connected in the undocumented community. So there was always that sense of risk for them being interviewed. What I found was actually because I was also talking to people that were starting businesses and were accepting a certain level of public, you know, public awareness of who they were. I thought that like the idea I was writing a book or that this might be more public was going to make people more shied away, but people were thrilled to be highlighted in a book. They wanted their names included. So it was actually a real surprise that people wanted to be included and didn't seem suspicious of me, you know? So I think it's all of us have our own personal, you know, positionality in all of that. But it was a really interesting lesson for me that when I thought people would really feel very concerned about staying anonymous, I actually had to go back and change my IRB so that I could use names because people felt so strongly that they wanted to be included in the book or they wanted their name out there.
Great. So here's a quick question about the farmers that you were talking to. Are they selling their products directly to market or to a third party or both? Kind of where are they in the market?
So most of the farmers that I talked to were selling directly to market. Some were selling like within their own communities. Some, especially if they had, an adult child that was kind of getting more market savvy. Some of them had like 19 or 20-year-old kids that were helping, would be like starting CSAs because they're realizing that's a really good thing for their business. And then, like I said, more in California and Washington, where they're getting pushed out of the market because there's just such a saturation of small scale farmers in these cities and these regions. Some of them were being pushed to the more wholesale markets because they just couldn't get in to the farmers markets where they would make enough money. And some of them were trying to get like restaurant contracts, but I think that took a certain level of social networking that they didn't have because those are really relationships. And without being able to speak English, without necessarily having the perfect packaging and the most beautiful, consistent produce, it was hard to get into some of those high-end restaurants that buy local. So really the farmers markets were the best places for them. It was the places that they felt the most comfortable and also where they could sell the diversity of crops.
Okay, a question from Miriam about how exactly do these immigrant farmers shift from industrial farming to being able to run their own farms? Are they, from their work at the industrial farms, are they getting enough resources for the shift? They have to keep the industrial farming job, and what barriers can they encounter running their own farms if they are not citizens?
That's a lot of questions. It really depended. It depended where in their kind of journey I met them. So in Virginia, I met a whole community of farmers that came from Jalisco like 30 years ago that had all come up to work in berries. And most of them did not work in the fields anymore. I mean, they were first generation immigrants. Many of them had actually gotten documentation in the 1980s through the immigration policy passed. It was like a very established community that had already been through this process, and it was amazing actually. They were selling in markets in DC and had been doing it for a while. As to how they first got started, I think it's really similar to the farmers I talked to in Washington and California that were much newer immigrants that still had a day job, and it's just saving. I mean, just really, they already know how to live so cheaply, right? But just saving every single penny and working so hard and self-exploitation. I mean, working every hour of the week and bringing in family to work with them. And, it's the economics of it are just astounding that they can do it. But they're not spending a lot of money, and they're saving it because this is what they're investing in. And was there a second? There was a second part of that question. The undocumented piece. So I never asked directly if people were documented or not, although I could usually figure it out from the way that they told their story, or some people would just volunteer the information, more often than you would think. For people that were undocumented, it was that type of kind of paperwork and certification, the fear of going into a USDA office or, a training program, just any kind of institution. But I think the way that some people got around that is really similar to actually Japanese immigrants during internment when they lost access to land, which is their children or other people do it for the legal part for them. And so, if they have someone in their family that's documented, that person does the forms, right? And so they kind of work around it. And I think it depends on the region and the state, how challenging that was for them too. And certainly market to market, like some farmers markets want to see all your identification and all your forms, and some don't. And so it just kind of depended, but many of them really did get over those barriers. And, there were certainly plenty that told me they were undocumented and doing this. And it was amazing to see.
Okay, a question specifically about California, since it has a much larger Hispanic community than most of the country. Did this allow for immigrant farmers in California to have increased support compared to the other places you worked?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that it was somewhat actually similar in Washington state, just places that have had a longer, more established immigrant community. So there already are multiple generations, like I said, of children that have grown up speaking English and that, you know, can help their parents out. Or actually the most supportive place I saw was in Washington state, where there were two staff members at the USDA office in Wenatchee who had grown up in farm worker communities and had really made it like their mission to support immigrant farmers. And so like they said to me, no one pays me for all the translation work I do, but they had created this incredibly welcoming office and they had gone out of their way to recruit farm workers to start farms. Like this was happening within a USDA office. And that was really spectacular. I never saw that, you know, even in California. So that type of support was really just individually motivated, but it really made a difference in that community. They were making sure, and this was actually mostly apple growing, where they were making sure that workers were getting the opportunity to buy into some of their previous owners' apple orchards. So that kind of support was really incredible. But certainly, I mean, places like California and Washington, where there's just a larger percentage of people that speak Spanish, it's much easier to even sell to like a cooler or a middle, you know, purchaser or a restaurateur, because there's just people that speak Spanish in all those institutions. Whereas in the DC area and Virginia, that, you know, it's such an isolated Spanish speaking community. So it's really different. So yeah, I think there's more support in those places, but also more challenges because of the competition.
Great, thank you. We have so many good questions in here. How would you recommend that teachers of technical and professional writing advocate and support immigrant farmers in terms of generating materials to help them navigate infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, I think the linguistic piece is so important and just the awareness that people might not have formal education. So not just, you know, actual translation being the first step of having resources available, at least for this community, resources in Spanish. There's other immigrant communities like Hmong farmers all over the country too. So I think there's been a real development of a lot of resources by different extension offices that have started to do translated, you know, guides to different kinds. And of course, this is regional, like different kinds of pests or different ways to do extension work that reaches out and communicates the really practical things that they need. You know, and then when I was interviewing people at the USDA, I was talking to someone that was working in the previous administration under Vilsack, the last time he was the Secretary of Agriculture. And there was a diversity initiative going on. And she, as someone working at the USDA, was frustrated because she said, yeah, we talk all about diversity, but no one's talking to kind of vulnerable farmers and saying, well, come in here, let me help you with your taxes, right? And I think what she was saying is just like those nuts and bolts that they need more help with, that they don't have an accountant to go to. So I think for a lot of them, those really basic business skills and farm management skills, that's what they need. They know how to grow food, but they don't know how to manage a business in the US. And so I think there's good examples of that. So ALBA, Agriculture and Land-Based Training Association in California, is doing an amazing job of Spanish language business classes geared towards farm workers. And Viva Farms in Washington. And there's the Green Market in New York State was doing that for a while too. And just recognizing it's those kinds of skills that they need help with.
Okay, we have a number of attendees here who work at food banks across New Mexico. And a question from that group, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, many people are relying on food banks and SNAP. What role do you think food banks could have to help some of these farmers, or do they already play a significant role?
Like in terms of, I guess, like in terms of like supplementing their diets, like as clients, or
do they provide much of a market or assist in any way? Like the local food banks buying food from local farms? I know the one in Albuquerque is trying to do more of that.
Yeah, I didn't hear very much of that because I don't think that the farmers have enough of like, they're not scaled up enough to sell necessarily the quantities that a food bank needs. Like, at least my understanding is like a food bank would need a lot of certain products to be organized around it. And so at least in California, I looked more at the relationship between farm workers utilizing food banks and the industrial farms that were donating. I haven't heard so much about, actually immigrant farms selling to food banks, but it would be amazing. I think it, their kind of scale is they have small quantities of a lot of things, which might not be as practical for that kind of, scaling up to sell to institutions yet. But if they could, I think it'd be a great thing, right? Especially because we know that oftentimes they're the same populations utilizing food banks and they grow the types of food that people would want to have. But I didn't see like any examples of it happening.
Thanks.
All right, we've still got a couple minutes left, but Rob, I'm going to compress your question here a little bit. He's asking about, you mentioned we're seeing the retirement of the traditional population of white farmers. Does the timeline for immigrant Hispanic farmers coming on the scene with their own farms generally start in the 1980s for your study area, coinciding with USDA settlement timeline?
I think it depends on the region. And it'd be kind of interesting to even just look, region by region or state by state at the USDA numbers around this. But, I only looked at 5 states. So it's hard to kind of make any conclusions about how and when it started. Like I said, in Virginia, I saw this community of farmers that have been there for several decades. In California, I was seeing a much newer group of immigrant farmers getting started, although I know there have been immigrant farmers in strawberries for the past several decades, a very different kind of population, more second generation. So I guess I don't really know. I don't know how it's going to map onto the retirements that we see coming up. I mean, I think for it to really practically map onto the current population that's retiring, there needs to be a much more structural shift of land ownership. Because certainly what I was seeing is farmers accessing these really marginal, really small plots, still mostly renting. There are some organizations trying to make that big ownership shift. So FarmLink is FarmLink is one organization. There's a few others, and some of these incubator organizations are trying to orchestrate, the passing on of land and farm businesses, because that would be the most practical way for this transition to happen. But of course, the farmers have to choose that they want more than anything for their farm business to stay in farming, not to make the most profit from selling it. So I don't know if that answers the question, but as far as how that shift could happen, I think it has to be ideally like the USDA subsidizing that shift, right, of ownership in some way, like something really big and structural.
A related question, did you find evidence of farmers aligning in groups like churches or other places to support this collective commitment to being a farmer that adhered to some of the principles that you identified?
Not so much. I'd never heard anyone talk about kind of like a church organization. Some of them talked about being, religious, but there was not a lot of affiliation with organizations associated to their farming practice. And in fact, that was something that I found surprising. There was a question also about co-ops in the chat. But whenever I'd ask well, are you interested in kind of being part of a group or an advocacy organization, or what about working with other people on this? And it was almost universally no, I really don't want to work collectively. I don't want to be part of an organization. And some of them talked about bad experiences working as part of farming cooperatives when they had tried to get started. I saw a lot of actually extended families with small farms in the same town, not working together at all. So there was not a sense that people wanted, and this is, within my research participants, it's not to say it's not happening at all. But there was a real resistance to kind of being involved in any organization or cooperative growing in a way that might seem like it could benefit. And I think it's because people are they want to have their own farm and they want to have their own business. And that's why they're getting into it, rather than wanting to do kind of a more social, organizational, or networked type of thing. So it was an interesting finding that really surprised me, as I didn't see them working with organizations at all.
So Maria, if I could just follow up on that. there's a robust literature that looks at things like institutional completeness in urban areas where people will migrate to an urban area. Their family members or people from their ascending region may migrate afterwards, and they start to build this organizational collective, if you will. And it's very interesting that you didn't find that. Farmers are known to be strong individualists. They have a very, very challenging career that they're pursuing, especially smallholder or migrant farmers. And I'm just surprised that there wasn't some sort of a church co-op thing going on where they would collaborate with each other. It's just very interesting. So thanks for speaking to that.
Yeah, no, I thought it was really surprising too. And I think it, like you said, the kind of individualist nature of agriculture and farming overall. And so I'm not sure that they're that different from a lot of other farmers that are really farming because they like being on their own. It's like it's a livelihood choice that they're making to not want to be in a city, to not want to be around people, to not want to deal with that. And they're, I've talked to plenty of white farmers that say the same thing. That's not, they don't farm because they want to work with a lot of people. And so I think there's something about agriculture, right, too.
Well, yeah, and then even just, I feel like there's diversity even within that, thinking of like Mennonite groups and other I'm thinking of like Scandinavian kind of collective culture, at least historically. So like there's like this kind of diversity within farmers as far as it's almost like you have to be fiercely collective or fiercely independent to survive somehow in a weird way.
Yeah.
All right, well, we have reached our time. Thank you for answering so many questions, and thanks for sharing your research with us and your knowledge, and for spending time with people even before the talk. We really appreciate you being here. I think this is a great way to kick off our spring semester. So thank you. And we will be posting the recording of this, and I encourage people to share it with those who weren't able to be here today who you think might be interested in this really important work. So thank you, Laura Ann, for being here. And hopefully we will get to bring you down to New Mexico at some point.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming out. I know it's exhausting, this whole format that we do all day now. So I appreciate the people showing up.
It's a great way to end the week, in my opinion. So, all right, team, we'll see you all back here in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lauren.